The main reason a coder would decide to go from JavaScript, HTML, and CSS and incorporate a language like PHP is probably the ability to integrate your website with a database. If you look around the internet, all the major websites, most of the internet that you browse consists of lists of content coming from databases. If you think of Amazon and products, or YouTube and videos, or Instagram and posts, all that content is coming from a database. There is a script like PHP that pulls that content out of the database, formats it in HTML, and delivers it on a web page. This will require a lot of different technology contributing to the overall process. So, for example, we are all familiar with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They work with the browser to render a web page. They are client-side languages. You should now be familiar with PHP. PHP is our server-side language. It helps the server generate our HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, and then deliver that code to our browser, our client computer. Now we have a couple new pieces. We have MySQL. MySQL is our database. Think of it as a group of complicated Excel spreadsheets. Then we have a small language called SQL. SQL is the go-between in between PHP and MySQL. It doesn't matter which language you're using or which database you're using. SQL is always going to act as that go-between. And finally, we have phpMyAdmin. This is a database administration tool. We are going to use phpMyAdmin. It's installed with MAMP, or it'll be provided by your hosting company. And we are going to use that to create our tables, add records, and so on. For this example, let's create a list of colors. This will give us some basic text data that we can use for more than just outputting text in our HTML. So to start your MAMP or WAMP server if you haven't already, and open up your start page. On the start page, there will be a link to phpMyAdmin. Now, if you're using your hosting as a method of testing PHP, somewhere in your control panel, there will also be a link to phpMyAdmin. You will have to reference your hosting documentation to figure out exactly how to create a username and password in a database. But once you have that and you have phpMyAdmin open, the process will be the same. So the database I'm going to work with, I've named Sandbox, and I'm going to create a table called colors. Now, unlike Excel, when working with MySQL, you need to specify what your columns are and what type of data they're going to store before you just start creating a spreadsheet. So I'm going to create a table called colors, and I'm going to include 3 columns. I'm going to give each of my colors an ID. That's a pretty common practice when you create a new table. That first column is often ID. I'm going to store the name of my color and the RGB value. My ID is going to be an integer value. My name is going to be a variable character value, and my RGB is also going to be a variable character. There are many types of fields. The primary ones you need to know are integer. Those are storing whole numbers. So numbers like 1, 2, 1,000, 10,000, not 1.5, okay, no decimals. You then have decimal values, where you have to specify how many decimal places you're going to store. You have a series of string data, primarily character and variable character. For now, variable character will work fine. For large blocks of text, you can use text fields. And then you have a series of date fields storing either complete dates, with times, just the year, column types like that. Next, in our variable character columns, I need to specify how many characters I'm going to store. So we'll do 20 for color, that should be plenty, and 10 for RGB. If you have defaults, you can specify those here. If you want to set some attributes, you can do those here. Now the couple things we are going to set is our ID is going to be our primary key. When that window pops up, you can just hit OK. A primary key is used to order our records or use to identify our records. So each record has to have a unique primary key value. You cannot have two colors both with the ID number 1. Also, I'm going to check off this checkbox here. It says AI. That stands for auto increment. That means as I add my colors, the database will automatically assign each record a number. And then I can hit save. Now, there are way more settings than that in there, but for now, this is enough. The good news is if you format your table very poorly, it's still going to work. If you start dealing with hundreds and thousands and millions of records, then table structure becomes crucial. But for now, it doesn't have to be done too properly. Hey, I am in my colors table, so I'm going to hit browse. Notice I have no records at this point, and I'm going to hit insert. So let's add a couple records. So we'll go with red. My RGB value is FF0000 for my red, green, blue value. We'll do blue. And we'll add 2 more. And now if I hit browse, we can see my colors. Now, the next step is to write a PHP file that is going to take our colors from our MySQL table and display them in HTML. To do that, you're going to need an SQL statement. Before we put an SQL statement in PHP, you can test out some SQL statements here. So I'm going to click my SQL tab, and for example, I can say select star from colors. And if I hit go, it'll show you the result of that query. I can then make a change here and go select star from colors, order by name. And if I hit go, order by name. And now if I hit go, and if I click edit, I can make a change. So if I add order by name, notice that the 4 records are now in order of name. I can also select specific records. So for example, select star from colors where name equals red. And if I click go, now we have a single record. SQL's primary use is to select data, to delete data, update data, and add data. Those are the 4 primary commands. There are more advanced things, but for the most part, and for this exercise, that'll be more than enough. The next step is to create a PHP file, extract our data from our database, and format it in HTML. So I've created a new file here called colors.php. I'm going to place inside my document our starting HTML tags. And in here, I'm going to place my PHP. Our first line of PHP needs to connect to our MySQL server. So I'm going to create a variable called connect, and I'm going to connect to my database. I'm going to use a series of PHP functions that start with MySQL. There is a variety of methods for PHP to work with a MySQL database. I've chosen this one because it's somewhere in the middle of being secure while still remaining simple. So I'm going to connect to our MySQL server. When we connect, we need to specify the host or the location of our server. If you're using a local server, the host is simply localhost. If you're using a hosting account, it might be localhost, but you'll have to check with your hosting company to see what should be used as your MySQL host. You then need your username and password. The default username and password for MAMP is root and root. If you're using a hosting account, again, you will have had to create a username with a password using the control panel. And then finally, our database. So mine is Sandbox. If you're using a hosting account, you will have to get your database name from your control panel. If I save that and open up my web page, we're not seeing anything yet, but that's a good thing. So at this point, we have no errors, which means our connection is successful. If I were to put in here a mistake, let's spell my username wrong and refresh. Okay, I'm now getting an error message. So here it's just telling me that access to my database is denied for user oot. If you are testing your PHP using a hosting account, you will need to create a database, a user, and locate your connection information somewhere in your hosting control panel. So I've logged into a Infinity free hosting account, and I'll walk you through the process in here. So I'm going to choose my domain name, log in to my control panel, and in your control panel, there's typically a database section where you will find a link to phpMyAdmin and a link to manage your MySQL databases. So I'm going to click on MySQL databases, and I'm going to create a database called Sandbox. Now I've created a database. Here is the full name. Here is my database username. My password is the same as my control panel password, and here is my host. Now, in my experience, in most control panels, after you create a database, you would actually separately have to create a user and then specify that your new user has access to your new database. And those are 3 different steps. Create a database, create a user, and then connect that user to that database. Next, I want to create an SQL statement. So I just create a regular variable. I'm going to use the variable name query, and I'm going to select ID, name, an RGB from my colors table. I then want to execute that query, so I'm going to create a variable to store the result called result. And to execute a query, I just use a MySQL query function. In my query function, I reference which connection I'm using. That's my connect variable defined above, and then my SQL statement, which is my query variable defined above. And for now, just to make sure this worked, let's see how many rows we got. So if I save that and refresh, you can see my 4 here. That tells us that all of our SQL and PHP up until this point are working successfully. We were able to connect without an error, we ran an SQL statement, and we found 4 records. Hey, and our final step now is to take those 4 records and display them. So I'm going to create a loop. I'm going to use a while loop. A while loop is great for running a loop as long as there is more content to run the loop with. So instead of using something like a for loop, where I'm going to have to specify how many times to run, I can use a while loop that says fetch the next record and run this block of code, and keep doing that as long as there is a next record to fetch. So while record equals, and I'm going to use a function called fetch assoc. This stands for fetch associative array. It's going to fetch the next record from our MySQL result, convert it to an array, and put it into our record variable. And for now, instead of outputting it in nice HTML, I'm going to use a function called printr. Printr is a function that is handy for debugging. It is just going to take the next record and output the entire record onto my screen. And if I refresh, I have a typo. I have spelt result wrong. I'm going to save that again and refresh. And there are my 4 records. Now that's a little hard to read. So what I can do is wrap my printr output with a pre-tag. Now you may not be familiar with the pre-tag. HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, the browser ignores white space. So if you have some content on multiple lines with lots of nice tabbing and well spaced out, that spacing does not show up in the browser. However, the pre-tag reverses that, so now it will maintain white space. So if I save this and refresh, it's just going to make that a little easier to read. So there you can see my 4 records. Each record has an ID, a name, and an RGB value. Now let's output those using an h2 tag. And if I save and refresh, we can now see my color titles. And because I have the RGB value, we could display the RGB value, or we can show them our color. So let's create a div. And our div is going to be given a style. So for each color, we're going to output a 300 by 40 pixel div, and we're going to set the background color of that div to the RGB value from our database. And if I save and refresh, now we can actually show our colors.